Okay.
Now you gotta start
The-
over.
the-
Remember everything you said.
The last 3 weeks, I have told our people who can't be here, I'll take it, and every week, something good happens, so. Greg, you're supposed to remind me.
You've asked the wrong person to remind you then.
Okay, well, let's look at Luke 13, 10 through 17. Okay, Linda, do you mind reading that for us? Let's read all 7 verses.
Okay. Now he was teaching in one of the synagogues on the Sabbath, and there was a woman who had a spirit of infirmity for 18 years. She was bent over and could not fully straighten herself. And when Jesus saw her, he called and said to her, "Woman, you are freed from your infirmity." And he laid his hands upon her, and immediately she was straight, and she praised God. But the ruler of the synagogue, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, said to the people, "There are 6 days on which work ought to be done. Come on those days and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day." Then the Lord answered him, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or his ass from the manger and lead it away to water it? And ought not this woman, a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan bound for 18 years, be loosed from her bond on the Sabbath day?" As he said this, all his adversaries were put to shame, and all the people rejoiced at all the glorious things that was done by him.
Thank you. So there's the story that we've been talking about this morning. Remember I said that she had been bent over. There was a lady down at Bainbridge that was that way. And, you know, think about this, and you can't see the sky, you can't look people in their face. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine the impact upon your view of life?
We had a lady here, Miss Ruth, what was?
Ruth Mays
Ruth Mays, thank you. I
had
can't-
severe kyphosis.
Oh, it was awful.
The woman came for worship instead of healing, and she does not approach Jesus or request healing. There is no mention of the woman's faith, which we've seen quite often when Jesus says your faith has healed you. It is all Jesus' initiative. I think this says something about Jesus. We don't have to ask. Sometimes he sees a need in our life and he fulfills that need rather than us asking. That's compassion, isn't it? That's initiative. You know, it's when you see someone. I was again watching a video on the computer, and they were making a point. This lady was at the top of an escalator. She had a child in a wheelchair, and she was going to have to pick the child up and in the wheelchair to get it down the escalator. And it showed all these people jumping in ahead of her. But then it showed this one man who had her pick up the child. He picked up the wheelchair, rode it down the escalator, and gave it back to her. She hugged him with that. That is initiative, right? He saw a need. He didn't need the woman to ask him, but he provided it to her. What we're doing beginning this month and providing food goods for Aaron McNeil House, the pantry here in Hopkinsville, is initiative. Aaron McNeil didn't call us and say, we need supplies. I'm sure they do. Part of being a follower of Jesus is doing what he did, and that is seeing a need and taking the initiative to fulfill that need.
Will we be doing this next week?
We're going to be doing it from this point on.
Okay.
Is that okay with everyone?
Absolutely.
Jesus is called to a woman that sets the stage for this healing. He speaks and she is healed. His words, like God, have power. An act of kindness and caring. He places his hand on her and she immediately stands straight. Let me stop there. Let's talk about the touch of Jesus. He wasn't afraid to touch people, was he?
Didn't matter who it was, what their condition was, what their job was, what their, anything.
Let's talk about that for a minute. I know that I didn't used to be a hugger. I'm still not a hugger, but I'm closer to it than I used to
Because of Barbara?
be. Thanks to Barbara. And thanks to some of the men at the jail. But how important, well, let me tell you the story. When we adopted Megan at 9 months, and I don't remember, Claudia could tell you the name of the condition, but Megan didn't respond to touch. She weighed 9 pounds. She showed no emotion or connection at all. It really bothered Claudia for the first month because it was just like holding a limp rag. She didn't respond. So that tells me right there that touch is important. How important is touch?
One of my professors in medical school gave some excellent advice. He said, young doctors, every time you see a patient in the hospital, every day, be sure you touch that person.
I think it's tremendously important. You know, we may not be wanting or asking someone to touch us, but it has an impact. The men at the jail, I mean, I didn't have a choice. All these men are much larger than I am. We had such a wonderful, I'm gonna deviate from it, we had such a wonderful service Thursday night. I didn't have many people there, they asked me to do 2 services. The last service I did, I could tell, I always go in with a plan, a lesson plan. But we spent about 5 or 10 minutes talking. And what I do during those 5 to 10 minutes is to determine whether I need to stick with that plan or go with something different. It was evident through this young man, you may have, one of y'all may have his prayer request. His name is Chip. And he's been in an abusive relationship for 6 years. People he loved have betrayed him. It was a night filled with tears from him. And I read him the story. Instead of sticking with my lesson plan, I think the Holy Spirit led me to believe, to read to him the story of the Garden of Gethsemane. And I told him, Jesus had just been betrayed by a loved one. He left 3 disciples close to him to keep watch. They slept. And my point to him was this: everything we go through, Jesus has gone through something very similar. And he can respond to us. So this woman here, he touches her, and then look what she does. This is one of those few instances where the person who is healed praises God. She praised God because, think about this, it wasn't a chronic illness, it was an acute illness. Did I get that wrong?
Yes.
It was something that didn't lead to death, but it was something that she had lived with for quite some time. And to be able to see the world differently. Let's move on.
Chip says, when you said that, his last comment was, pray that someone I love finds Jesus.
Yes.
I think that's really, says a lot about him.
Well, you know,
Put that in a prayer. It wasn't about him, it was about pray that someone I love finds Jesus.
pardon me.
Pray that someone I love finds Jesus.
You know, the thing I discovered with Chip, and it's only because I've been through the same thing. We may want to change people we love, but most of the time, we're incapable of changing other people unless they're willing to change. And what he's facing this issue. Does he continue this relationship, or does he end this relationship? And I know it's going to be tough for him. But I also told him this. I said, you just told me all the bad things that have happened in the previous 6 years. Do you want another 6 years of this? And that's the reality we have to come to. Well, let me get back on the subject with the young lady here. Because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, the synagogue leader is indignant. But he doesn't rebuke Jesus or address him directly. Look at that passage. Instead, he addresses the crowd, in the process delivering a direct rebuke to both Jesus and the woman. That's in 14. And the synagogue leader was indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, and he begins saying to the multitude in response. Now, why would he address the crowd and not address Jesus? And why does he include the woman in his rebuke? Because in the next verse he says there are 6 days to work, and he basically tells a woman, if you wanted to be healed, you could come here the next day and meet with Jesus, and he would heal you.
He's trying to make an example.
Pardon me?
He's trying to make an example out of Jesus.
Yes, he is. What he's doing, he's not only rebuking Jesus and the woman, but he's telling the rest of the multitude, be careful what you do on the Sabbath. Be careful what you do on the Sabbath. The fourth commandment, I've given you some leeway on there. The fourth commandment prohibits work on the Sabbath. It cites the example of God who rested on the seventh day and requires the day to be kept holy. Now I want to clarify something for you. We celebrate church and worship on Sunday, which is not the Sabbath. I had a young friend of mine, and when we lived in Lexington, we were tennis partners. That is, we were tennis partners until he tried to convert me to Seventh-day Adventist. I thought Seventh-day Adventists were basically Baptist people who went to church on Saturday. I found out later that was not the case. They believe very strongly that if you don't worship God on Saturday, then you're not saved. And you know, we all grew up in a time where very few stores and things were open on Sunday. It's the direct opposite of that today. Now, I think most of us in this room assume that that is no longer a day that has to be kept in the same perspective that Dr. Fuqua just mentioned about Jewish people. I grew up in a community where the majority of particularly older women would cook on Saturday, and you would eat it on Sunday because they weren't, cooking on Sunday was against the rules. But we lived on a dairy farm, and cows have to be milked on Sunday. And I never could understand as a young man why milking the cow was okay, but fixing food for adults were not okay. And that's pretty much what he's saying here. Remember, Jesus is saying, you have no problem taking your animals out and giving them water on Sunday. But you prohibit me from healing a woman on that same day. And that's the point he's making. The leader holds a responsible position, and he's trying to uphold what he understands to be holy. What he fails to understand is that acts of compassion are holy. Acts of compassion are holy. It is as if the Torah, intended to reveal God's will, has become a veil over his eyes. Jesus has harsh words for this man. Now, I'm going to put a caveat in here. And I think all of us understand. Every person in a position of authority struggles with appropriate limits and enforcements of standards. You know, when I was general manager of HWA, we had rules. But not everything fit perfectly into those rules. Sometimes there were things different. One of the ordinances, and this is something I normally did, Brett was chairman of the board, but he's not chairman anymore, and I don't work there, so we can talk about this. But it says that if you don't pay your bills within 30 days of the due date, you get cut off. Nothing to do with it. I began to start telling people that I'll let you go 30 days if you promise to make the full payment at the end of 30 days. I won't cut you off. Or we work out a payment plan for people. You know, again, I'm going to go off subject here for a minute. Hopkinsville has the highest number of rental properties in the state of Kentucky. The majority of people who own rental property in this town requires the occupant to get water in their name. Okay? Many times I would have a renter come to me, they have a $400 water bill because they had a leak in their house that the owner refused to repair. And I didn't think it was fair to penalize them for something they had no control over. I think that's what Jesus is talking about here. It's not a clear black and white line, but there's some gray in there. What exceptions do you allow? What consequences do you impose for failure to meet standards? In this story, Jesus calls us not to hew to the rules to the extent that we lose sight of the person in need. Let me ask you this. One of the things the religious leader wanted, the synagogue leader, he wanted the woman to wait until tomorrow. She's been this way for 18 years. One more day won't hurt. You know what Jesus is saying? One more day for a person in need is too long. It's too long. I was looking for this passage this morning. I couldn't find it. I think it's in James. But in James, I think he writes this. If you see a person in need and your response to them is, I'll pray for you, and you don't provide it, shame on you. I'm paraphrasing what he's saying. What he's saying for you, if you see a person in need, I think he's saying not only pray for them, but do what you can to fulfill their need. Praying for them and sending them on their way doesn't really help much. Because what you're doing is you're praying that God will provide. Well, he's doing that through you. What makes us think that it's someone else's responsibility to provide something to the poor that we can provide? Right? Now let's complete out. The hypocrisy of the leader has to do with his inconsistency. He believes the Torah permits helping animals on the Sabbath, but not human. He presumably believes that it is holy to love kindness, as Micah 6:8, but not on the holy Sabbath. I had marked and I pulled that out this morning in Micah 6:8. But basically what Micah 6:8 says, if I can't get there real quick, it's one of those small books that if your finger I knew it was right after before Nate come. Let me read that for you. Micah 6:8. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Now, keep that thought in mind. What if God is telling us we need to do, what if that's in conflict with what the rules and the law and the church says? What happens if it's in conflict? I'm talking about justice. Wednesday night we were talking about loving your neighbors as yourself. And I asked a question because one of the people that watched it on Facebook called me about it. Because my question to them is, how neighborly are we in the United States? Well, let's talk about justice for a minute. Are we a just nation, or do we have injustice?
Currently, it doesn't look like we're very just.
No.
But what we do, they say is for justice,
Yes.
which is so interesting. So injustice is for justice.
See, what we do is we put focus on the rules rather than focus on the individual. Right? Taking a 12-year-old off of his bicycle as he's riding to school
It's not justice.
is not justice. I'm normally silent on those things, but that really bothered me this week when I saw that video. And God calls us to do. Let me read Micah 6-8. And here's the thing, this is not the only place that's at. It's also in Zechariah. Jesus repeatedly says this. He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God? Now let me ask you this. We just looked at this scenario where we have the synagogue leader and we have Jesus. Which one followed God's command here?
Jesus.
Jesus. The synagogue leader was more important about keeping the rule than he was about healing this woman. You know, I think it would have been different if he had been bent over for 18 years.
Yeah.
Do you think he would have told himself, you know what, I'll wait till tomorrow to be healed because today's the Sabbath? He would want to be healed right then, right? One day is too long.
One of the things that I see that I personally feel that's wrong with the way our country is going right now is that the injustices we see aren't affecting us personally. And so we kind of shrug our shoulders and let it go. And we can't do that and continue as a society.
You know, and that's what God is speaking about here. It wasn't just the religious leader's responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility. You know, it's, I want us to look, because I think this is the neatest part of the story that we just read. 13, right? I keep moving my ribbon out. Luke 13. Okay, let's look at verse 17. You know, it's easy to overlook this, but I think verse 17 is the key to this. Look at how the people responded. And as Jesus said this, all his opponents were being humiliated. So apparently it wasn't just a synagogue leader that was upset, but apparently some members of the synagogue was upset too. Some of the congregation were being humiliated. But then it says the entire multitude was rejoicing over the glorious things being done by him. Now, did they rejoice because this woman was healed? Or were they rejoiced because Jesus put the synagogue leader and the rules in their place?
Probably a little of both.
Okay.
It says all.
You know, ordinary people are the ones that are generally hurt by rigid authority. Right? One of the things I've noticed by going to the jail, I very seldom see rich and influential people in jail. It's really the people that, you know, I told you this before, the majority of them can't afford an attorney.
Or bond.
The judge sets the bond, and here in Kentucky, one of the few states that does this, here in Kentucky, you have to pay the full bond. In Nashville, you have to pay 10% through a bail bond. But here you have to come up with a full bond. Until you pay for that bond, whether you have not had a trial to determine your guilt or your innocence. You're in jail because you can't pay a bond.
And they will languish there for months and months and months before they ever go to trial.
Because what they're looking for is they're looking for a court hearing to reduce their bond. Well, our system is so overrun with the number of people that sometimes it gets delayed 3 months, another 6 months, another 9 months. So they're in jail the whole time until they either have a trial or they pay their bond. Ordinary people are the ones that are generally affected by rigid authority. We're talking about injustice. It was not justice for Jesus to ignore this woman's condition and not heal her. And you know what? He did it. There was another time that Jesus was walking and his disciples were walking through a field on the Sabbath. And if you remember the story, the disciples are pulling off heads of wheat, rubbing them in their hands, blowing away the chaff, and then eating the kernel. And the Pharisees, as always, was right behind them, and they said to Jesus, "Don't your disciples care about the Sabbath?" And I think it's one of those few moments where Jesus kind of loses his, I don't want to say he lost his temper, but he probably lost some of his patience. And he said this. He said, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." I think that puts everything in perspective. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Let me finish up with the last paragraph from Dr. Jacobson. When God is up to something, prepare to be unbound, whether from confining diseases or social norms about persons with disabilities or even holy pieties. The fact that Jesus does this within the Jewish tradition and for a daughter of Abraham shows that God keeps showing up. He keeps drawing the circle just a little wider. I love that there. He keeps drawing the circle just a little bit wider. You know, initially it was Abraham and his plan. Then it was increased to include all the Jewish people. And then after Jesus died on the cross, it began to start including Gentiles. But even through all of that, we keep dismissing certain groups of people in this. And every time God shows up on the scene and works, the circle just keeps getting wider and wider. We think about that when we serve, when we go to the table, right? This man, Dr. Jacobson, speaks about that. He says God is unleashing a diving horizon that begets rejoicing over the loosing of every human's bondage. We who gather around the table should not be surprised. There, sometimes despite ourselves, we glimpse the great and glorious thing that God is doing. Celebrate that space that is there for all and give our thanks and praise. The God who shows up does not lead us out of our fellowship, but more deeply into it, with others and with Jesus who are committed with his very journey to the strange thing that God deems necessary. I've shared with you time and time again the unique experience of offering communion to the men at the jail. It happened again Thursday night. The joy that is seen, because see what they do? They see me being on the outside, and they consider me to be very religious and pious. But you know, that's you know, I go to church every Sunday. They see a difference between me and them, although I try not to explain that. But here I have a meal with them in the presence of God. And there's a connection that has begun to be built at that point in time. And that's what communion, remember in communion, Jesus says, as often as you do this, remember me. And I think a lot of times we look at that as remembering his death, burial, and resurrection on the cross. But why couldn't he also remember my acts of kindness, my acts of compassion, my acts of mercy, my acts of generosity? Every time that we observe communion, we remember Jesus. And it changes us.
Sometimes those men and women in jail, that's the first time they ever had communion.
It was that way Thursday night.
Yeah.
And, you know, I explained to them, because one of them did say, he said, well, I'm not a member of your church. I said, our church doesn't require that. I said, this is God's table. It's not Ben Hale's table. It's not First Christian Church of Hopkinson's table. This is God's table. I make this point to them. Jesus said at the Lord's Supper with the man who was going to betray him. Did Jesus say, we're not going to have supper until Judas disappears? He held open communion of the Lord's Supper with the man who was going to betray him. He had it with the man who was going to deny him 3 times. And that isn't who we are. Most gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word this morning. I ask and pray, Father, that we will always hold in highest regard our treatment of other human beings. God, help us to be reminded that you created all human beings. And you create all human beings in your image. Help us, dear Lord, to align our hearts with your heart. Help us, dear Lord, to see people through your eyes. Help us, dear Lord, become disciples of Christ, and that everything we do in our community and our lives are done in a manner pleasing and acceptable to you, and it bring people closer to you. We ask all these things in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
And I want to thank Matt and Neely for being with us this morning. It was a blessing.